Hey guys, this is Ms. Morrison. This is a little bit more of algebra review. This first problem is like number 10 on your homework. It says -7 plus 7i and 2 plus I. Okay, first we're going to go ahead and multiply and distribute. And I like to do something called FOIL. You don't have to. You can just write it all left to right. That's what I'm going to do after I FOIL it anyway, so you'll just be ahead of me. Okay, so -7 multiplied 2, that's the first. And that makes -14. Then -7 multiply I is just -7i. Then I are the insides. From FOIL, the I from FOIL are the insides, 7i times 2. And that just makes positive 7i. And then lastly, 7i times I is 7i squared. But then, anytime you have an I squared, we cross it out, and instead we replace it with a parentheses and a -1. So I squared is equal to -1. That's from college algebra. And that gives you -7. And then now we're going to write it all down left to right. So we have -14 minus 7i plus 7i minus 7. And if you check it, the i's cancel out and we get -21. Woohoo! So the thing to remember here was that I squared is -1. Not just I, but I squared. There has to be a tiny 2 in there. Okay, let's look at number 11. We have to multiply by something called the complex conjugate. What? Which is the same thing that's on the bottom, but a different sign in the middle. So we're going to multiply the top and the bottom by the same thing in the bottom, but instead of this minus sign from the bottom, we're going to put a plus. And what that will do is it will create a difference of squares on the bottom, and the i's will end up canceling out, because in math you can never have an I on the bottom. So even though there's a division sign, we're actually not dividing. We're just multiplying by the bottom, but with an opposite sign. Okay, so let's multiply. If I multiply the top, that should be pretty easy. Let's see here. 3i times 5 is 15i. 3i times 4i is plus 12i squared. But then anytime you have an I square, you cancel it out and you put parentheses -1. So this gives me 15i, and then what is that, a -12? Yep, okay. And in math, we always put the janky stuff on the right side at the end. So we're going to put the good old pretty real number -12 first. Then we're going to put that imaginary number 15i at the back. And that 15 is a plusative, so let me put a plusative. Okay, now let's work on the bottom. If I work on the bottom, there's two things multiplied by two things, so I'm going to use FOIL. And let's see here, F times F. Okay, first times first. 5 times 5 is 25. Outsides, 5 times 4i is plusative 20i. Insides, -4i times 5 is -20i. Last, -4i times 4i is -16i squared. But remember, anytime we have an I squared, we cross it out and we put parentheses -1, and that gives me a plusative 16. Okay, so now let me figure out what this bottom is going to be. I definitely have a 25. It looks like the oi's cancel out, And then the L is just a plus 16. So that makes 41. Yeah. Okay, so let's put it all back on top of each other. The top was negative 12 plus 15i. The bottom was 41. And I'm good to go with that, but your homework might ask you to split it up. And if you split it up, just split it up into two fractions, negative 12 over 41. And then plus sign, because there's a plus sign before that 15. 15 over 41. And then when we have i's, they like you to put it big into the side. So the answer to this sucker are these two fractions. The real fraction first. Real means there's no I. And then on the second fraction, this should be the imaginary part with the I. And if you put them backwards, your homework won't count it, I don't think. Okay, let's look at number 12. Number 12 on your homework says something about solve by factoring. So this is that whole add multiply thing. So we have to add to negative 2, multiply to negative 8. And I think the two numbers that multiply to the negative 8 are a 4 and a 2. But one of them has to be negative. And I need them to add to this negative 2 in the middle. So if I put positive 4, negative 2, that doesn't give me negative 2 when I add. I have to use negative 4, positive 2. And then the rest of this problem says equals 0. So let's write equals 0. And then in math, when you have a bunch of things in parentheses equal to 0, you can split it up and say x minus 4 equals 0. X plus 2 equals 0. And then finish it. If I get x by itself, you plus 4 and subtract 2. Hey, baby, that's my answer. Your homework probably just wants 4 and negative 2. It probably doesn't want x equals. Okay, number 13, it says the same thing. It says something about factoring and solving. Okay, this one's kind of awkward because there's a 4 on that x squared. So why don't we try and take a GCF? Is there anything in common you see in between 4x squared and 16x? Well, both of them are even, so we can divide both of them by 2. But let's look for the greatest number that you can divide both by. The greatest number that you can divide both by is 4. Now there's a letter on both of these terms before the equals. So I'm going to write a letter down, x. And I'm going to use the smallest exponent. So the smallest exponent is not 2, it's 1. So my GCF is 4x to the 1. So now I'm going to write that 4x to the 1. Open parentheses, something equals 0. Okay, now I need to ask myself, what multiplies with this 4x to give you 4x squared? Well, an x. So we're trying to kind of like backwards FOIL, backwards multiply. So what multiplies with 4x to get 4x squared? Another x. What multiplies with 4x to get 16x? A 4. What kind of a 4? A plusative. All right, so we wrote our GCF and the leftovers. And then the leftovers in the parentheses just have an x. So we're done. We can stop factoring. If there was an x squared, we need to check and see if you could do number 12 again. Okay, so now we're going to equal each chunk to 0, and we get 4x equals 0, x plus 4 equals 0. So we're definitely going to have a negative 4 from over here on the right, because when you subtract 4, you get negative 4. But then for this 4x, if you divide by 4, you just get 0. So your answer is negative 4 and 0. And in your homework, it probably just wants the negative 4, comma, the 0. Okay, let's look at number 14. I think it said solve using something called the square root property. Yeah. Okay, basically that means you're going to get the thing with the squared alone. Then you square root. So let's get the thing with the squared alone. How am I going to move this 54? How am I going to move this 6 that's multiplied? Well, to get rid of the 6 that's multiplied, I'm going to divide by 6. And you get x squared equals 9. Okay, and then the square root property says, now that you have your squared by itself, put a house on it and you're done. Because the tiny 2 in the house cancels, the tiny 2 in the square root cancel, and then the square root of 9 is 3 and -3. Don't forget, it's kind of like saying plus minus 3, but I'm not sure if your homework will count the plus minus.